I think accountability is a key feature of a restorative transformative process. Where the FGC process in New Zealand often fails, not always, but often fails, because we have some really good practitioners who push the envelope, but often fails is the accountability. Our idea of accountability is extended along our whakapapa lines, our genealogy. It's shared by everyone. Everyone that's at Moana's talk yesterday, I think she gave a far better description of it than I did. And that ability to be accountable, which spreads out right across our whānau, our families, and our hapu, our sub-tribes, is not available in this context. So therefore, it is ineffective from a Māori perspective, from this Māori's perspective anyway. My mother keeps telling me, you're not the only, the only one Maori. She's Scottish though, so I say, you got no say. Anyway. Sorry. So in some ways, the fiction of its restorativeness and indigenousness, right, it was invented by policy and restorative justice industry players. And I'm going to talk about why that really annoys me, gets me hoha in a minute. In other words, these things, I ran through this with a mate of mine, Robert Webb, the other day, and he said, oh, that's a bit strong, invented. And I said, yeah, all right, but I like to shock. But exaggerated, okay, because why I describe the restorative justice industry are those people in there that are developing and franchising programs, standard programs. And in the big four, those neo-colonial contexts where First Nations reside, the Maori-ness of this product is just, it's just wonderful, It's almost like having the All Blacks in New Zealand, fronting, selling underwear or something, our sales go up 40%. And it's because it's exotic, I've been annoyed though, they never asked me to front any ads and stuff like that. So maybe I look a bit scary, maybe. I'm those Maoris that are a bit scary. Some of the key issues for First Nation justice in relation to the restorative justice industry, the role of the policy players, the franchisers, the appropriators of our ways, okay, is, and I won't go on, because I want to spend a bit of time talking about standardization and its impact. The key issues that are facing this is the old one of indigenization. I think in Canada, in fact, where most of that critique of indigenization has actually been made quite forcefully by Haverman and others, and Ted Pallies and what have you have spoken about it as well. Indigenization, does everyone here know? Do I need to go into great detail about indigenization? In the 70s and 80s in Canada, for example, you really had an acknowledgement that there was a problem, that the police and your First Nations weren't getting on too well. And so indigenization I talk about two different components of it now. One is indigenization via human capital, increasing the number of brown people in your police force and your correctional institutions and your courts. Okay, so it's simply not changing the structure, not changing the practice of policy, but just getting more brown faces to go out there and talk to the brown people. Okay, I talk about that as human capital indigenisation. And then there's the, utilisation of symbols, language, and acceptable practices. Because some of our practices are unacceptable from a Eurocentric point of view, you sort of slide them sideways. The only term I can think of is that's philosophical indigenisation, as I call it. Okay, so you borrow some words and some ideas, and you simply just smack it on the end of a Eurocentric way of thinking about social harm and how you deal with it. The other way of looking at that is I guess, a more sophisticated way now in the last 20 years has been appropriation and co-option. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, the appropriation of, I'll give you an example in New Zealand. In New Zealand, in our prison system, we have something called IOM, Integrated Offender Management. We actually came to Canada, because in Canada you had something similar. Yeah, and we basically took your whole model and brought it over to New Zealand and added a bit of Maori stuff onto the end of it, right? It's a miserable failure. And what they did was they took basically what was a Eurocentric theoretical paradigm, thinking about how you respond to social harm. The psychology of criminal conduct is its theoretical bases. You developed a whole system in which included a whole bunch of criminogenic programs. You deal with drug and alcohol. The individual is the focus of treatment, not the social and context and environment that he's grew up in and is going to go back to. the individual, you deal with drug and alcohol, you deal with their anger management, you know. And then they thought, oh, we might have a bit of a problem. These may not be suitable for Maoris. So what they did was they actually developed blended programs. They call them tikanga programs, which is a real insult. Tikanga is our word for our philosophy, our worldview. You know, tikanga is very important. It's the rules of living and engagement between people. So they call them tikanga programs. Right? They might as well call them noa programs, which means crap. Yep.
I don't think those programs worked here in Canada. They had a good job of selling them.
So what they did was they said, oh, and I don't know if any of those of you are actually au fait with that types of approach. In that theoretical approach, it's individual, it's psychological based. Culture, and in fact it's even written, culture plays no part in explaining, understanding or responding to an individual or a community's social harm issues. So culture's got nothing to do with it. Except as a response from the responsivity principle. But if we can utilise their beliefs and all this sort of thing in social context to get them prepared to undergo psychological counselling or these criminogenic programs, then fine. So they made these programs where they actually had psychological based programs, and they were called blended, and they would have our kaumātua, our elders or Māori come in to talk to these guys about identity issues and that, and get them feeling really happy, and then so that they were responsive. So this is an appropriation and a co-option. You're utilising an element of our cultural practice, and you're wedding it to a Eurocentric program. And as you do so, you're fundamentally missing the power of our ways of doing things, because you're simply nitpicking the bits that you want. And then, of course, they can turn around and go, we're incredibly culturally responsive. You know. Before I move on to go to Orientalism, that indigenization issue, I've actually been criticised for criticising that, this issue, and not giving agency to Māori that work in the criminal justice and care and protection field. Alison Morris, who's a British criminologist who's done extensive work in FGCs, finally responded to my critique last year, and she wrote in the paper that Tauri ignores the fact that a lot of Maoris work as social workers, and I wrote an email saying, well, actually, no, I do recognise that, but what you failed to recognise is that 2 years before you wrote this paper, so, the Department of Social Welfare that we had, Child, Youth and Family, surveyed all their social workers, particularly Māori, and asked them what they thought of the processes we have in place, and over 80% said they're crap. They're inappropriate, they're disempowering, and they don't work, and we prefer to have other ways. So I just thought I'd make that point. Okay, Orientalism is something, a terminology, and I guess an explanatory tool that I've utilised in the last couple of years to talk about what's happening, what I see happening in terms of the international transfer of some of these products like FGCs from our jurisdiction into other neo-colonial jurisdictions like Canada, the United States and Australia. That Maoriness I talked to you about, you know, the exotic, that's been utilised as a marketing tool. Okay, in which, in other words, you know, I've got people like Gabriel Maxwell came here a couple of years ago here and gave a paper saying this works well for Māori, it's a Māori-centred process, it's going to be good for your indigenous people. That's Orientalism. You know, everyone heard of Edward Said, who unfortunately died last year, famous Palestinian social theorist. He utilised this terminology to talk about how European societies or colonisers lumped whole people who looked and sounded the same from wide geographical areas and simply looked for the sameness. So it was a way, the Orient, they talk about the Orient as though there's no difference between your Mongolian, you know, steppe tribes and your, you know, Asians living in Hong Kong, right? So I utilise that term, you know, the Orientalism is what is at the basis of the selling of FGCs and other RJ products across these jurisdictions, particularly when it's seen as good for us Indigenous people. Okay, it's, you know, the principles behind it is, okay, FGCs is a Māori-inspired process. Canadian First Nations are First Nations, Māori are First Nations. So therefore anything that is based on a First Nations program will be good for other First Nations. That's an Orientalist assumption, an Orientalist approach. And it's a very powerful basis to the industry's marketing of particular products. I mean, we can develop pan-tribal organisations if we wish, and we do have in New Zealand. We spend a lot of time arguing, you know, making fun of each other, but we can do that. But we would never extend that to my iwi getting up there to say, I've got an absolutely fantastic program. To be honest, it does happen every now and then, and it doesn't last very long. But for us to enforce our tikanga on Ngati Kanganunu, who's just down the road, you know, we used to try doing that in the old days of warfare, and it sort of got a bit of a nasty response. So, and I'm still amazed today when, like, the policy industry in New Zealand and even RJ people they come into our country or into our area and they say, I've got this wonderful program for you. I'm from Wisconsin. I'll pick on Wisconsin because it's the Yanks. I could say Ontario or whatever, you know. And don't you think it's great? It's been, oh, look, we've tested this to death. We've got all the evidence in the world. It works. You know, and then they wonder, they get upset when we tell them to take a hike. I don't know. I never understood that. The last key issue I want to talk about is standardization and best practice, my two favourite words at the moment. I wrote a paper last year about this issue, and it was actually it was something I've been thinking about for 3 or 4 years, and it was driven by, I wrote a paper by a guy called Jonathan Rudin, who I think he lives here in Vancouver, I think, or he works here. Toronto. Sorry, Jonathan. Oh, actually, no, he gave a paper here at a conference a couple of years ago. That's right. And I thought, damn, because I was actually thinking of writing a paper along those lines, and he stole it. But anyway, and his paper was focused on this whole issue of standardization. And the reason I want to make a point of this is it is a major problem for us, because if the one message I'm trying to give is the industry, some industry players at the moment, both policy and RJ focused, okay, the practices of design and marketing and uptake of your programs is incredibly disempowering for us, and we've had enough. So this is the sort of fight back. I'm the face of the Māori fight back, if you like. But anyway, standardisation to me is a really critical issue. It is wedded to this whole thing called evidence-based policy that's developing in our jurisdiction at the moment. Okay, you know, standardisation, the rise of RJ as a legitimate policy response to social harm in New Zealand in the 90s. It was very slow here. It was very much, even though we invented FGCs, you know, we didn't really have any coherent policy work begin until about 96, 97. And we're a little bit behind because then, a couple of years ago, our crime prevention unit, which is part of our Ministry of Justice, suddenly said, "Oh, we're getting all this pressure to contract restorative justice," and you know, with all good intentions and goodwill. I heard a great. Was it you that told? Did I hear that comment from today? Your mother says, "Good intentions are a pathway to hell," or something. I can't remember.
Road to hell is paved with good
That's the one. Yeah. So, you know, don't get me wrong. I think there was good intentions. I thought, well, there is an increased need for this. An increased needs coming from a very verbal, growingly, not aggressive is not the right word for RJ people. I can't think of a better one. Provocative. I don't know. Challenging the state, the legitimacy of the state's focus on punitive policy. So we need other ways of doing things. So they thought, right, okay, well then we've got to fund more. We've got to know more about it. So they piloted some community group conferences with adults outside of the FGC, outside of the youth jurisdiction with FGCs. So we need to know more about it. We need to be sure we're getting value for money. We need to be sure that the practitioners aren't doing any harm. So we need to standardise our contracting process. We need to standardise and have a definition of RJ, you know, that is set, slightly flexible around the edges. We need to put in place the training. We need to ensure that people who are going out there are doing no harm. And I have no problem with that, with those principles. Okay, and so you design, you know, you contract in someone to design your you know, accreditation, your accreditation processes, you know, your diplomas and your masters and what have you, so that you can ensure that everyone is up to the same standard and utilising the same tools and languages and what have you, reporting things back the same, so that we can do a paper up to the minister saying there were 45 interventions here and this happened. You know what I mean? Standardization. Those three words, international best practice, are the three words that I hate the most. Every meeting that I go into in New Zealand, and I fight for our policy people to turn their head away from Canada and all those other wonderful exotic places and what's happening there, and to focus on what's happening in our communities and what we're doing or want to do to empower us. I get told, oh, we're importing multi-systemic therapy. That's my favourite. Started to come into New Zealand 4 or 5 years ago. We want to use multi-systemic therapy. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? That's an American franchised, quite intensive, individual-focused, mainly youth-focused program. If you go online and look at it, it's fantastic. It's got the best marketing I've ever seen in crime control. But it's very much psychology, criminal conduct based, very individual based. And that's the big one because there's so much evaluative material saying how fantastic it is. You know, 60% non-recidivism after 3 years, blah, blah. But we go into meetings with the policy people saying we want to use this intervention philosophy and approach for this, and we go, no, we've got our own way. Oh, so what's it about? Oh, well, it deals with the four main chief important things in a young person's life: their family, school, peers, blah, blah, blah. And we're going, oh, in other words, it's a holistic approach. Oh, we've never heard of that. I've been bloody doing it for 200 or 300 years or whatever. Oh, that's interesting. The Americans invented it, right? But then we get, international best practice. It's got an evidence base. See, it's got the evidence base. But that international best practice, that evidence base, favours Eurocentric notions of justice, practice, and the language of justice. We, unfortunately, in Māori, we have plenty of evidence about what our processes look like and whether or not they work. We don't tend to write it down so much. And I'm not being facetious there. We do have a problem, and I've argued this at a couple of criminal justice conferences of late, is that we need to start validating our own processes, even if it's in our own language and what we're comfortable with, but we need to challenge this international best practice approach because it'll kill us all the time. Okay, we're never going to be able to demonstrate, we're never going to be able to compete for resources with the way the industry is actually validating its own practice. Most of it's dodgy as hell, to be honest, the practice. But then I turn around and go, well, that's great. You've got an international best practice that's based on evaluation in a social context like Wisconsin again, or wherever, or Bradford in England. But how do you know it's going to work for Māori kids that live in Wainuiomata? And they go, oh well, we can add on some Māori stuff, appropriation. You know, we'll allow you to have karakia prayer in the beginning. Talking about that FGC, there was a review of FGCs a couple of years ago, and one of the main findings I found really interesting is that they acknowledged when they went through, and I think they reviewed about 200, observed 200 FGCs, and they actually, the evaluators themselves weren't Māori, but they actually acknowledged that the marginalisation of Māori, of our elders, like they said, invariably Māori cultural, it's supposed to be a responsive process, but generally the only time that Māori are actually able to practice being Māori and Māori process was they would invite one of our elders to get up and do a prayer at the beginning and at the end, and that's it. So this whole standardisation wedded to the development of an empirical evidence base, development of international best practice products that can then be sold, as really it favours this cross-jurisdictional transfer of philosophies and policies and practices that's going on. I think that, you know, standardisation, and those who love standardisation, oh no, our models are flexible, we can add and go. But I deal mainly with policy people. You know, the policy process is their enemy as far as I'm concerned. And they go, no, we're flexible. No, they're bloody not. They get that standard, that's it. And we can't change this. We're not going to move this 5 years down the track. If we start having more Māori kids that are, rather than having to deal with them dealing with dope, we get into P or methamphetamine and stuff like that. You know what I mean. In other words, it's very hard to change the borders and boundaries of that particular policy context.